What had you been doing?
I had been studying.
Why had he been running?
He had been running to catch the bus.
Who had they been talking to?
They had been talking to their teacher.
When had she been cooking?
She had been cooking all morning.
Which book had you been reading?
I had been reading Harry Potter.
Where had you been working?
I had been working at a cafe.
Whose car had they been washing?
They had been washing their dad's car.
Whom had she been helping?
She had been helping her friend.
What had the dog been doing?
The dog had been barking loudly.
Why had you been waiting?
I had been waiting for my sister.
Who had they been following?
They had been following a celebrity.
When had you been cleaning?
I had been cleaning before dinner.
Which game had he been playing?
He had been playing chess.
Where had they been living?
They had been living in Spain.
Whose idea had you been discussing?
We had been discussing Jane's idea.
Whom had he been meeting?
He had been meeting his boss.
What had she been watching?
She had been watching a documentary.
Why had they been shouting?
They had been shouting because of the match.
Who had you been chatting with?
I had been chatting with my cousin.
When had they been practicing?
They had been practicing since morning.
Which team had you been supporting?
I had been supporting the Red Sox.
Where had he been studying?
He had been studying in the library.
Whose jacket had you been borrowing?
I had been borrowing my brother's jacket.
Whom had they been teaching?
They had been teaching a new student.
What had you been learning?
I had been learning Spanish.
Why had she been crying?
She had been crying because of the sad movie.
Who had you been working with?
I had been working with Jack.
When had he been training?
He had been training early in the morning.
Which food had they been eating?
They had been eating pizza.
Where had you been traveling?
I had been traveling through Europe.
Whose song had you been listening to?
I had been listening to Taylor Swift's song.
Whom had she been calling?
She had been calling her mom.
What had you been searching for?
I had been searching for my keys.
Why had they been laughing?
They had been laughing at a joke.
Who had been organizing the event?
They had been organizing it.
When had you been planning this?
I had been planning it last month.
Which movie had you been watching?
I had been watching Frozen.
Where had they been going?
They had been going to the mall.
Whose house had you been staying at?
I had been staying at my uncle's house.
Whom had they been emailing?
They had been emailing their professor.
What had she been painting?
She had been painting a landscape.
Why had you been walking so fast?
I had been walking fast to get home.
Who had been leading the team?
John had been leading the team.
When had you been organizing the files?
I had been organizing them yesterday.
Which lesson had he been studying?
He had been studying math.
Where had she been playing tennis?
She had been playing at the club.
Whose laptop had you been using?
I had been using my friend's laptop.
Whom had they been inviting?
They had been inviting the whole class.
What had he been fixing?
He had been fixing the car.
Why had you been sitting there?
I had been sitting there to relax.
Who had they been avoiding?
They had been avoiding their boss.
When had you been exercising?
I had been exercising at 6 a.m.
Which project had they been working on?
They had been working on the science project.
Where had you been walking?
I had been walking in the park.
Whose advice had you been following?
I had been following my dad's advice.
Whom had she been texting?
She had been texting her friend.
What had you been preparing for?
I had been preparing for an exam.
Why had she been waiting?
She had been waiting for the bus.
Who had been watering the plants?
I had been watering them.
When had you been driving?
I had been driving last night.
Which subject had she been studying?
She had been studying biology.
Where had they been fishing?
They had been fishing by the lake.
Whose car had you been driving?
I had been driving my mom's car.
Whom had you been calling?
I had been calling my brother.
What had they been cleaning?
They had been cleaning the room.
Why had you been whispering?
I had been whispering to not disturb others.
Who had you been relying on?
I had been relying on my team.
When had you been learning French?
I had been learning French last year.
Which instrument had you been playing?
I had been playing the guitar.
Where had they been driving?
They had been driving to the countryside.
Whose phone had you been borrowing?
I had been borrowing my sister's phone.
Whom had they been questioning?
They had been questioning the suspect.
What had she been sewing?
She had been sewing a dress.
Why had you been feeling tired?
I had been feeling tired after running.
Who had been baking the cake?
My mom had been baking it.
When had you been organizing the event?
I had been organizing it last week.
Which team had they been playing against?
They had been playing against the Eagles.
Where had you been cooking?
I had been cooking in the kitchen.
Whose pen had you been using?
I had been using Jack's pen.
Whom had he been thanking?
He had been thanking his teacher.
What had you been writing?
I had been writing a letter.
Why had they been arguing?
They had been arguing over the match.
Who had been buying groceries?
I had been buying them.
When had you been planning to travel?
I had been planning to travel in July.
Which car had he been driving?
He had been driving a BMW.
Where had you been playing soccer?
I had been playing in the field.
Whose homework had you been helping with?
I had been helping with my sister's homework.
Whom had she been sending letters to?
She had been sending them to her cousin.
What had they been building?
They had been building a treehouse.
Why had you been working late?
I had been working late to meet a deadline.